The cruelest victories are the ones celebrated too soon. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors, where champagne glasses chimed softly and camera flashes captured every carefully staged smile. Ethan Walker stood at the center of it all with effortless confidence, one hand resting around the waist of his stunning fiancée, Vanessa Brooks, a famous runway model whose elegant white gown seemed designed to command every eye in the room. Their engagement party felt less like a celebration and more like a performance, complete with wealthy investors, social media influencers, business executives, and reporters eager to document the city's newest power couple. Every laugh echoed with approval. Every compliment fed Ethan's pride. Then the grand entrance doors opened. Conversation slowed before silence quietly settled across the room. Claire Bennett stepped inside alone. Her navy maternity dress flowed gently around her figure, revealing the unmistakable curve of her pregnancy without demanding attention. She wore no expensive jewelry beyond the simple wedding band she had never replaced, now resting on a delicate chain beneath her collarbone where no one else could see it. Her blonde hair rested neatly on her shoulders, and her calm expression carried neither bitterness nor embarrassment. She looked like someone who had already survived the hardest chapter of her life. Ethan noticed her immediately. The corner of his mouth lifted into the same confident smile that had once convinced Claire he would love her forever. Vanessa followed his gaze before whispering something playful into his ear, earning another round of laughter from several guests standing nearby. Ethan raised his champagne glass and welcomed Claire loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. "Claire, you actually came. I wasn't sure you'd want to watch your replacement become my wife." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room, but nobody interrupted him. Claire simply nodded once. She had expected nothing different. Vanessa slowly walked toward Claire with perfect posture, her designer heels clicking across the marble like a countdown everyone could hear. She studied Claire from head to toe before allowing her eyes to pause on the gentle curve beneath the fabric. Her smile remained flawless. "I didn't realize you'd be bringing someone," Vanessa said sweetly while glancing toward Claire's stomach. "Well, almost someone." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through nearby guests. Another woman covered her mouth to hide a grin. Someone lifted a phone just slightly higher to record the exchange. Claire lowered one hand across her stomach with quiet instinct rather than defensiveness. The tiny movement lasted only a second, but it carried more tenderness than anything else in the ballroom that evening. Ethan watched carefully, expecting tears, anger, or an argument. Instead, Claire simply looked around the magnificent room they had once dreamed of entering together years earlier when they could barely afford dinner dates. Nothing about the luxury surprised her anymore. Wealth had lost its power to impress the day she learned peace could not be purchased. Ethan stepped closer with practiced confidence. "You know," he said, swirling the champagne inside his glass, "I always believed people should move forward instead of living in the past." Claire met his eyes without raising her voice. "I agree." Her answer landed so gently that it confused him. "No accusation. No regret." No attempt to defend herself. Only quiet certainty. For a brief moment, Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle beneath his confidence, but it disappeared as quickly as it arrived when another guest congratulated him. Across the ballroom, the front doors opened once more. Few people noticed at first. A tall man wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped inside with the calm confidence of someone who never needed an introduction. He carried no arrogance, no entourage, and no urgency. His eyes searched the crowded room only once before finding Claire. Without speaking a single word, he began walking toward her while dozens of conversations continued, completely unaware that the most important guest of the evening had just arrived. The stranger crossed the ballroom with unhurried confidence, his polished black shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. He did not glance toward the photographers, nor did he acknowledge the curious whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd. His attention remained fixed on Claire alone. She recognized him instantly, and for the first time that evening, the weight resting on her shoulders seemed just a little lighter. Ethan narrowed his eyes, searching his memory for the man's face, but nothing came to him. Vanessa folded her arms with quiet amusement, assuming this was simply another guest who had mistaken Claire for someone else. The man stopped beside Claire, offering a gentle smile instead of an embrace. "I hope I am not late," he said calmly. Claire answered with the smallest nod. "You arrived exactly when you meant to." The exchange was so ordinary that it almost felt disappointing to those watching. There was no dramatic declaration, no extravagant entrance, no attempt to steal attention from the engagement celebration. Yet something about the stranger's composure unsettled the room far more than loud confidence ever could. Ethan stepped closer, forcing another practiced smile. "Claire, are you going to introduce your friend?" His voice carried just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. The stranger extended his hand first. "Adrian Sterling." Ethan accepted the handshake automatically before releasing it almost immediately. The name meant nothing to him. He offered a polite nod and turned back toward Vanessa as though the conversation had already lost its importance. Several guests did the same. Adrian looked like a successful businessman, perhaps an attorney or an investor, but certainly not someone capable of changing the balance of the evening. Claire noticed Ethan's indifference without reacting. She had spent years watching people measure worth by appearance, titles, and rumors. Adrian had never needed any of those things to command respect. Across the ballroom, a middle-aged executive carrying a crystal tumbler suddenly froze. His eyes widened the moment they landed on Adrian. He whispered something to the woman beside him before immediately walking in their direction. Another executive noticed the movement and followed. Within seconds, 3 more distinguished guests quietly abandoned their conversations. Ethan frowned. Vanessa looked around with growing confusion as several influential figures who had barely acknowledged the hosts now gathered near Claire instead. The first executive reached Adrian and extended both hands warmly. "Mr. Sterling, I had no idea you would be here tonight." Adrian smiled politely. "Neither did I until this afternoon." Another guest laughed respectfully. "Our board has been trying to schedule a meeting with you for months." Adrian answered with effortless humility. "My office mentioned that. We will find time soon." Ethan's smile slowly faded. He recognized every executive standing there. They represented companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Men who rarely waited for anyone were now patiently waiting for Adrian to finish each conversation. Claire remained quietly beside him, saying almost nothing. She did not need to explain who he was. The room itself had begun answering that question. Vanessa leaned closer to Ethan. "Who exactly is he?" Ethan pulled out his phone beneath the table, careful not to attract attention. He typed Adrian Sterling into a search engine with casual confidence, expecting a brief business profile. Instead, the screen filled with headlines, magazine covers, private aviation awards, and photographs beside presidents, international leaders, and Fortune 500 executives. His thumb stopped moving. His breathing slowed. One headline caught his attention more than all the others. Adrian Sterling, founder and chairman of Sterling Aerospace, owner of the largest privately operated luxury jet network in North America. Ethan stared at the words as though they belonged to someone else. Then he slowly lifted his eyes toward Claire, suddenly realizing that the woman he believed had walked into the ballroom completely alone had never been alone at all. The ballroom no longer sounded the way it had only minutes earlier. The laughter that once followed Ethan now dissolved into cautious whispers as more guests quietly searched Adrian Sterling's name for themselves. One by one, glowing phone screens reflected the same headlines, the same magazine covers, the same photographs beside heads of state, Fortune 500 executives, and gleaming private aircraft carrying the unmistakable Sterling Aerospace emblem across their polished tails. Nobody announced the discovery aloud. They did not need to. The atmosphere changed all on its own. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket, forcing himself to breathe normally while pretending nothing had happened. He had spent years learning how to project confidence during difficult negotiations, but this felt different. Every instinct told him that he had underestimated the man standing beside Claire. And perhaps even more dangerously, he had underestimated Claire herself. Vanessa noticed the subtle shift immediately. A few guests who had been waiting eagerly to congratulate her now drifted toward Adrian instead, politely introducing themselves as though they had stumbled into the most important networking opportunity of the year. Her perfect smile tightened for only a fraction of a second before she recovered. She leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "Why did nobody tell us he was coming?" Ethan did not answer because he did not know. Claire remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, one hand resting gently beneath her baby bump, her posture relaxed, her expression calm. She neither encouraged nor discouraged the growing circle around Adrian. She simply watched as conversations unfolded naturally. That quiet confidence unsettled Ethan more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Finally, unable to tolerate the uncertainty, he stepped forward again. "Claire," he said with a measured smile, "I have to admit this is unexpected. How do you know Mr. Sterling?" Every nearby conversation softened as guests instinctively listened. Claire looked at Adrian first. He gave the slightest nod, leaving the answer entirely to her. She returned her attention to Ethan. "We met when I stopped looking for people who measured success by appearances." Her voice remained gentle. There was no sarcasm, no accusation, just honesty. Ethan attempted a laugh that sounded thinner than he intended. "That does not really answer the question." Adrian finally spoke, his tone warm and respectful. "Sometimes the most important answers take longer than a single evening." The response carried no arrogance, yet it quietly ended the exchange. At that moment an elderly gentleman approached, walking with deliberate confidence despite the silver cane in his hand. Several guests immediately stepped aside to let him pass. Ethan recognized him at once. Charles Whitmore, one of the most respected investors in private aviation, rarely attended social events without a compelling reason. To Ethan's surprise, Mr. Whitmore ignored the hosts completely and extended both hands toward Claire. "It is wonderful to see you again, Claire." She smiled with genuine warmth. "It has been too long." The older man glanced down at her stomach, his eyes softening. "You look happy." Claire answered with quiet certainty. "I finally am." Ethan felt his heartbeat stumble. Again, another influential figure already knew Claire. Again, she had never spoken about it. Mr. Whitmore turned toward Adrian with an affectionate grin. "You chose well." Adrian answered simply. "She chose herself long before she ever chose me." Silence settled over the group. Those words carried more weight than any announcement could have achieved. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment, overcome not by embarrassment but by gratitude. Nobody in the ballroom had ever defended her with so few words and so much respect. Ethan looked between them, struggling to fit the pieces together. He had invited Claire believing she would arrive carrying the scars of their past. Instead, she had walked into the room carrying something infinitely more powerful. Not revenge, not resentment. A quiet life built so completely beyond him that he had never even known it existed. And for the first time since she entered the ballroom, Ethan realized the evening was no longer about his engagement at all. Claire could feel dozens of eyes following her, yet none of them carried the weight they once would have. There had been a time when every whisper could steal her sleep and every judgment could shake her confidence. That woman no longer existed. She had disappeared months earlier. Quietly and without ceremony, the morning she decided that surviving was no longer enough. Ethan watched another influential guest greet Adrian with unmistakable respect before turning toward Claire with equal warmth. It was a pattern he could no longer ignore. These were not casual acquaintances gathered by coincidence. They knew her name. They spoke to her with familiarity. They treated her as someone who belonged in their world. Vanessa slipped her arm through Ethan's, attempting to reclaim the attention drifting away from them. "Everyone," she announced with a polished smile, lifting her champagne glass. "Thank you for joining us to celebrate our future together." The applause that followed was courteous, but noticeably restrained. Before the moment could settle, Charles Whitmore chuckled softly and looked toward Claire. "Forgive an old man for changing the subject, but I have been waiting months to congratulate you." Several guests turned toward him. Claire smiled politely. "That is very kind of you." "No," Charles replied. "What you accomplished deserves recognition." Ethan frowned. Vanessa glanced between them, confused. Charles continued with genuine admiration. "Walking away from everything familiar while expecting a child takes extraordinary courage. Building an entirely new life afterward takes something even rarer." The ballroom grew still. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, not out of shame but humility. She had never wanted applause for surviving. Every early morning she had spent working, every doctor's appointment she had attended alone, Every evening she had quietly prepared for motherhood had been choices made without an audience. Adrian looked at her with quiet pride, saying nothing because he understood that some victories should never be interrupted. Ethan felt an uncomfortable knot tighten in his chest. "You make it sound like Claire accomplished all of this alone," he said carefully. Charles met his gaze without hostility. "She did." Those two words landed heavier than any accusation. Ethan searched Claire's face, hoping to find anger or resentment that would somehow make the situation easier to understand. Instead, he found only peace. It was unfamiliar. During their marriage, Claire had always tried to earn approval, always believing one more sacrifice might preserve what they had built together. The woman standing before him no longer asked anyone for permission to exist. A server quietly approached Adrian with a silver envelope. "Sir, this was just delivered." Adrian thanked him and glanced briefly at the contents before smiling. Perfect timing. Claire looked at him curiously. "Is everything all right?" "Better than all right," Adrian answered. "The final approval came through this evening." She tilted her head. "Already?" Adrian nodded. "The nursery at the Children's Aviation Education Center will open exactly as scheduled." A nearby guest overheard the conversation and smiled. "That was your project?" Adrian gently gestured toward Claire. "It was her idea. I only helped make it possible." Several people looked at Claire with renewed admiration. She had quietly designed a program that would provide educational opportunities for children whose families could never afford them, and she had never mentioned it once. Vanessa's smile finally began to crack. She had spent the evening displaying expensive jewelry, luxury vacations, and glamorous photographs, believing admiration could be collected through appearances. Yet the woman she had mocked minutes earlier was earning genuine respect without asking for it. Ethan slowly realized that the room had stopped measuring success by wealth alone. They were measuring character, generosity, and quiet resilience. For the first time since Claire had walked through those doors, he understood that he was no longer competing against another man. He was standing face to face with the consequences of every choice he had made, while the future he once believed belonged to him was already walking calmly in another direction. The celebration continued, but its rhythm had changed in ways that could not be hidden behind music or polished smiles. Guests who had arrived expecting to witness the perfect engagement now found themselves quietly fascinated by the woman who had spoken the fewest words all evening. Claire had never asked for attention, yet somehow every meaningful conversation drifted back to her. Ethan noticed it each time another executive crossed the ballroom, offering Claire a sincere greeting before congratulating him with little more than polite courtesy. It was as if the room had unconsciously rearranged its priorities. Vanessa attempted to recover the spotlight by inviting several photographers to capture more engagement portraits near the grand staircase. Camera flashes brightened the room again, but the excitement felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Even the photographers occasionally glanced toward Adrian and Claire, sensing that the most compelling story of the evening was unfolding somewhere beyond the carefully staged pictures. Claire reached for a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. Adrian accepted one as well before quietly asking, "Would you like some fresh air?" She smiled gratefully. For a minute, they stepped onto the terrace overlooking the city skyline, where cool evening air carried away the noise from the ballroom. Thousands of lights stretched across the horizon like scattered stars resting on the earth. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply. "I almost did not come tonight," she admitted. Adrian leaned lightly against the stone railing beside her. "I know. I was afraid seeing the past again would remind me of who I used to be." Adrian looked toward the skyline before answering. "Instead, it reminded you how far you have traveled." Claire laughed softly. "You always know the right thing to say." He shook his head with an easy smile. "No. I simply tell the truth." Before Claire could respond, the terrace door opened again. Charles Whitmore stepped outside, carrying 2 small dessert plates. "I thought you both escaped without trying the lemon cake," he said with a grin. Claire accepted a plate with appreciation. "Thank you." Charles looked at her warmly. "Do you remember the first day we met?" Claire nodded almost immediately. "You came to the Aviation Education Center after the roof collapsed during the storm." "No," Charles corrected gently. "I remember arriving prepared to donate money. Then I watched a pregnant woman organizing volunteers. Before sunrise, refusing to leave until every child had a safe classroom again. That was the day I understood leadership. Claire lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with praise. Anyone would have helped. Charles smiled knowingly. That is what remarkable people always believe. Through the ballroom windows, Ethan watched the conversation unfold from a distance. He could not hear a single word, yet he recognized the expressions. Genuine admiration, honest affection, respect earned over time instead of purchased overnight. None of it made sense according to the version of Claire he had carried in his mind since the divorce. He remembered the woman who doubted herself whenever his business demanded another sacrifice. He remembered someone who always stood one step behind him. He never imagined she would eventually stand somewhere he could no longer reach. Vanessa approached his side and quietly asked, "Why are you still looking at her?" Ethan answered without taking his eyes off the terrace. "Because I keep realizing I never really saw her before." Inside the ballroom, another announcement invited guests to gather for the formal champagne toast. Conversations gradually shifted back toward the stage, and people began returning to the glittering hall. Claire placed her empty plate onto a nearby table and rested one gentle hand across her stomach. Adrian instinctively slowed his pace to match hers as they walked back inside together. Neither of them noticed Ethan standing only a few feet away until their paths finally crossed once again. And this time, the question waiting behind his eyes was no longer driven by pride. It was driven by regret. The master of ceremonies invited everyone toward the center of the ballroom, where a raised platform overlooked the glittering crowd beneath the chandeliers. Crystal glasses were placed into waiting hands as soft music faded into silence. Ethan stood beside Vanessa, smiling for the cameras once again, but the confidence that had carried him through the beginning of the evening no longer felt effortless. Every few seconds his eyes wandered through the crowd until they found Claire. She remained beside Adrian, speaking quietly with guests who genuinely seemed interested in hearing her thoughts instead of simply being seen beside her. Ethan realized something unsettling. Claire had not spent the entire evening trying to prove anyone wrong. She had simply been herself, and somehow that had changed everything. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone before inviting Ethan to offer a few words about the future. Ethan accepted the microphone with practiced ease. He thanked investors, friends, and family for supporting his journey. He spoke about success, ambition, and new beginnings. His words were polished, confident, and carefully rehearsed, earning polite applause from the audience. Then he looked toward Claire almost without thinking. For the briefest moment he forgot the speech he had memorized. A memory quietly surfaced instead. He remembered a tiny apartment where Claire had stayed awake after midnight helping him organize business proposals across their kitchen table. He remembered her encouraging him after every rejection letter. He remembered promising that if success ever came, they would celebrate it together. The applause brought him back to the present. He forced another smile and stepped away from the microphone. Vanessa accepted it next, thanking everyone for embracing their future together. She spoke elegantly about glamorous destinations, exciting opportunities, and the wonderful life waiting ahead. When she finished, the audience applauded again, although this time the enthusiasm sounded noticeably softer. Before the evening could move forward, Charles Whitmore slowly approached the stage. "If I may," he said with a warm smile, "I would like to offer a toast as well." Nobody objected. Charles rarely spoke publicly unless his words truly mattered. Holding his glass carefully, he looked across the room before resting his eyes on Claire. "Most celebrations honor what people have gained," he began. "Tonight, I would rather recognize what someone refused to lose. Her integrity, her kindness, her courage." Complete silence settled over the ballroom. Charles continued gently. "Many people become generous after they become successful. Claire remained generous when she had almost nothing. That is far more remarkable." Several guests quietly nodded. Adrian looked toward Claire with unmistakable admiration, but he never interrupted the moment. It belonged entirely to her. Claire seemed almost overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. She lowered her eyes and softly shook her head as though hoping the praise might pass to someone else. Charles smiled. The finest people I have ever known always become uncomfortable when recognized. That is how you know their character is real. Glasses slowly lifted throughout the room. One by one, guests joined the toast, not because anyone instructed them to, but because it felt right. Ethan watched dozens of successful men and women honoring the woman he had once believed would never accomplish anything without him. He finally understood that status could open doors, but character was what made people remember your name after you left the room. As the glasses gently touched together, Adrian quietly reached for Claire's hand. She looked at him surprised. Without saying a word, he turned her left hand slightly toward the light. Resting beside the delicate chain beneath her collarbone was a simple engagement ring that had remained hidden throughout the evening. The nearest guests noticed first. Their surprised expressions spread quietly through the ballroom like a gentle wave, and within seconds Ethan's eyes followed theirs. He stared at the elegant diamond catching the chandelier light, suddenly realizing that the greatest surprise of the night had not yet been announced. Claire instinctively drew her hand back, almost embarrassed by the attention the ring had created. She had never wanted a grand announcement, and Adrian understood that better than anyone. He simply smiled at her with quiet reassurance before releasing her hand again. There had been no dramatic proposal beneath fireworks, no photographers, no audience. Months earlier, he had asked a single question while they watched the sunrise from the observation deck of a small private airport after volunteering at the Children's Aviation Center. He had promised that he would never ask her to become someone different, because the woman she had fought to become was already extraordinary. Claire had accepted with tears in her eyes and complete certainty in her heart. Tonight, the rest of the world had discovered that promise by accident. A gentle wave of congratulations spread through the ballroom. Several guests approached Claire, admiring the elegant ring, but more importantly, offering sincere wishes for the life waiting ahead. Nobody seemed interested in the size of the diamond. They admired the quiet happiness reflected in her smile. Ethan remained frozen beside the stage. He had imagined countless versions of Claire's future after the divorce. None of them had looked like this. He had expected bitterness, loneliness, perhaps even quiet resentment. Instead, she had found respect, purpose, genuine friendship, and a love built on patience instead of pride. Vanessa noticed the growing distance between herself and the crowd. Even as guests politely congratulated the engaged couple, many quickly drifted back toward Claire and Adrian afterward. For the first time all evening, Vanessa lowered her champagne glass without taking another sip. She walked toward Claire with a composed expression that barely concealed her curiosity. "Congratulations," she said carefully. "I suppose there is quite a story behind that ring." Claire answered with gentle honesty. "The story is actually very simple." Vanessa waited. "He never tried to rescue me," Claire continued. "He simply respected the life I was building, and one day I realized I wanted him to be part of it." Adrian looked at her with quiet admiration but never interrupted. Those words meant more to him than any public declaration. Vanessa forced a polite smile before excusing herself, yet even she could sense the difference between admiration earned through appearances and admiration earned through character. Across the ballroom, Ethan slowly approached Claire. His footsteps carried none of the confidence they had held earlier in the evening. When he finally stopped in front of her, the conversations around them softened naturally. Nobody expected an argument. They simply felt that something unfinished had finally reached its moment. Ethan looked first at the engagement ring, then at Adrian, before returning his eyes to Claire. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Claire remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Not because tonight embarrassed me," he admitted. "Because I spent years believing your kindness would always be there no matter how little I appreciated it." The words hung gently between them. They were not dramatic enough to erase the past, yet they carried a sincerity Claire had never heard during their marriage. She studied his face for a long moment before offering a calm smile. "Thank you for saying that." Ethan swallowed carefully. "Can you ever forgive me?" Claire rested one hand across her stomach before answering. "Forgiveness is something I gave myself a long time ago. It was the only way I could move forward." Ethan lowered his eyes, understanding that her answer was neither rejection nor reconciliation. It was freedom. She no longer carried the burden of their history because she had already set it down. At that exact moment, the ballroom doors opened once again as one of Adrian's senior executives hurried inside with an elegant leather portfolio in his hands. He walked directly toward Adrian, smiling with unmistakable excitement, and quietly said, "Sir, the final documents have arrived. Everything is official now." The senior executive carefully opened the leather portfolio before handing the documents to Adrian with unmistakable satisfaction. "Congratulations, sir," he said warmly. "The final signatures were recorded 30 minutes ago. The transfer has been completed exactly as planned." Adrian glanced through the first page before closing the folder again without any hint of celebration. He simply nodded. "Thank you. Please thank the entire legal team for working through the weekend." The executive smiled. They insisted on finishing tonight because they knew how important this project was to both of you. Claire looked at Adrian with quiet curiosity. "You never told me it would be finalized today." Adrian's expression softened. "I wanted it to become real before I said anything." Charles Whitmore stepped closer, unable to hide his excitement. "Then I suppose everyone here deserves to know." Adrian hesitated for only a moment before turning toward Claire. "Only if you are comfortable." She gave a gentle nod. Adrian addressed the guests with the same calm voice he had used throughout the evening. Several months ago, Claire imagined a place where children facing difficult circumstances could discover aviation, engineering, and science without worrying about tuition or family income. She believed opportunity should never depend on where a child was born. Tonight, that vision officially became reality. Curious whispers spread through the ballroom. Adrian continued. "Sterling Aerospace has completed the permanent endowment for the Claire Bennett Aviation Discovery Foundation. Every operating expense has been secured for generations." Complete silence followed. Then one guest quietly began to applaud. Another joined. Within seconds, the ballroom filled with sincere applause unlike anything heard earlier that evening. This was not admiration for luxury or influence. It was respect for purpose. Claire stood motionless, visibly overwhelmed. She had dreamed of opening a single educational center. Adrian had quietly ensured that the mission would continue long after both of them were gone. She looked at him with tears gathering gently in her eyes. "You named it after me." Adrian smiled. "Because it was always your dream." Ethan felt every word settle heavily inside him. During their marriage, Claire had often spoken about creating programs for children who rarely received opportunities. He remembered politely telling her that dreams like that could wait until they were financially secure. Somehow he had never realized those dreams were part of who she truly was. Vanessa looked around the ballroom, watching executives, investors, and community leaders lining up to congratulate Claire. The expensive engagement decorations suddenly seemed strangely insignificant beside a legacy that would change thousands of lives. She quietly lowered her eyes, understanding that elegance could attract attention, but compassion earned lasting admiration. Charles lifted his glass once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, wealth builds impressive buildings. Character fills them with meaning. Tonight we have witnessed both." Another wave of applause echoed through the ballroom. Adrian reached for Claire's hand again, but this time there was nothing hidden between them. The engagement ring reflected the chandelier light as naturally as her smile. Ethan slowly approached one final time, his expression no longer carrying envy, only acceptance. "I spent years chasing success," he admitted softly. "I never realized I was leaving greatness behind." Claire regarded him with quiet kindness. "We were both different people then." Ethan nodded. "You became the person you always wanted to be." Claire gently rested her hand across her stomach and smiled. "No. I finally stopped trying to become someone else." Those words lingered in the silence that followed. They carried no bitterness and no triumph. They were simply true. As the orchestra began another gentle melody, the ballroom lights reflected across the windows overlooking the city, and everyone present sensed that the most meaningful celebration of the evening had never been the engagement they had come to witness. It had been the quiet victory of a woman who chose dignity over resentment, purpose over pride, and a future far greater than the past anyone else had imagined for her. The applause slowly faded into a peaceful hush, leaving behind something far more powerful than celebration. It was understanding. The ballroom still sparkled beneath the crystal chandeliers, The orchestra still played softly in the background, and the city lights continued glowing beyond the towering windows, yet everything felt different. The evening had quietly transformed from a display of success into a reminder that the strongest victories rarely demanded an audience. Claire stood beside Adrian with one hand resting gently across her stomach, while the other remained comfortably in his. Neither of them reached for the spotlight. They simply accepted the kindness surrounding them with quiet gratitude. Charles Whitmore approached one last time before the evening came to a close. His smile carried the warmth of someone who had witnessed many lifetimes of ambition. People spend decades trying to leave a legacy, he said softly. Some discover they already began building one the moment they chose kindness instead of bitterness. Claire smiled, touched by his words. I only wanted to build a better future for one child at a time. Charles nodded. That is exactly how every meaningful future begins. Across the ballroom, guests slowly resumed their conversations, but many paused before leaving to shake Claire's hand, congratulate Adrian, or simply thank them for the foundation that would soon change countless young lives. The engagement party everyone had expected would dominate tomorrow's headlines suddenly seemed secondary to a story nobody had anticipated. Ethan remained quietly near the stage, watching the room empty little by little. The applause, the admiration, the respect, none of it belonged to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the woman who had spoken the least. Vanessa gently touched his arm. There was no anger in her expression, only honesty. You still care about her? Ethan looked toward Claire before answering. I care about the person I failed to recognize when she stood beside me every day. Vanessa gave a slow, understanding nod. Then perhaps tonight was not only difficult for her. Ethan managed a faint smile. No. Tonight finally showed me who I was. Vanessa squeezed his hand gently before walking toward the exit alone, understanding that some conversations could only happen within a person's own heart. Claire noticed Ethan approaching one final time. This time there was no tension between them. No competition. No unfinished argument waiting to be spoken. Ethan stopped a respectful distance away. I do not expect another chance, he said quietly. I only hope one day I become someone worthy of the forgiveness you already gave me. Claire's expression remained gentle. Then do not spend your life looking backward. Build something that helps someone besides yourself. That is where peace begins. Ethan nodded slowly. Thank you, Claire. She smiled one last time before turning toward Adrian. Without another word, Adrian offered his arm, and she accepted it naturally. Together they walked through the grand entrance doors beneath the soft glow of the evening lights. Outside, a sleek black sedan waited silently at the curb. Adrian opened the passenger door before carefully helping Claire inside, always mindful of her comfort. There were no photographers chasing them, no dramatic farewell, no triumphant speech. The driver closed the door gently, and the car pulled away from the hotel with quiet elegance, disappearing into the shimmering lights of the city where a new chapter already waited. Ethan remained standing beneath the entrance canopy long after the taillights vanished from view. He finally understood that the greatest loss of his life had never been his marriage ending. It had been failing to recognize the extraordinary woman standing beside him, while he was too distracted by his own ambition to see her worth. Inside the moving car, Claire looked through the window as the city passed by in peaceful silence. Adrian gently placed his hand over hers, and she smiled without saying a word. The future no longer frightened her because it was no longer built upon proving anyone wrong. It was built upon love freely given, purpose quietly pursued, and a family waiting to welcome a child into a life filled not with resentment, but with hope. She never won Ethan back because that was never the victory she needed. She found herself, and in doing so, she discovered a life far greater than the one she had once been afraid to lose.